Hi, I'm Scott, and I'd like to welcome you to the progressive topic lecture that Travis Cochran and I are going to do over the 2024 January-February LD topic about military presence in the West Asia North Africa region. Before we go any further, I want to give you the exact wording of the 2024 January-February LD topic, and that wording is resolved. The United States ought to substantially reduce its military presence in the West Asia North Africa region. So this progressive topic lecture is going to include the following things. It is going to give a topic background. It is going to talk about topicality, value criterions, philosophy affs, all sorts of different policy affs, which if you look at the wording of the topic that I just read, I think that this might sound a lot like a policy debate topic lecture, and that's because this topic is different from some of the past topics we have in that it is actually a policy statement. So we're going to get through all of that, and then we are going to end by Travis talking about critiques. So let's get into the basic topic background. So basically, when looking at this topic, I decided that this topic is just huge. I think it's one of the biggest debate topics that we've had, and that this topic video would have been like 3 hours long had we done all of the video that we wanted to do that included the background, the arguments, all types of that stuff. So what we did is we broke this down into multiple videos. So I'm not really going to say much for the topic background here. I'm not really going to say anything at all. But I'm just going to point you in the direction of the topic lecture that I put out the day the topic was released for just like tons of background information on the topic. And then also the traditional LD video has a bunch of this as well, especially starting with the contentions portions that Travis has at the later half of the video. The one thing that I do want to do if you just don't watch those videos is I just want to pull up a map of what the region looks like. I don't know, I'm a big map person, maybe that's my history background, but these are probably most of the countries that are included in West Asia, North Africa. Obviously, the military presence, the U.S., its military presence, part of the topic, is going to limit some of these countries out. Some people might argue some of these aren't, some are, there's more. That's debatable. I don't really think, based on my knowledge so far, that there's an inclusive or exclusive definition that says is or isn't, but I just think that this is a good geographical map-based representation of potentially the region that we are talking about with this topic so that you can help visualize exactly what we are going to be talking about. So since we are talking about exactly what we're talking about, I want to jump and talk about topicality for a second. So as I was alluding to with the map there, I think one of the things for topicality for this topic is it is exceptionally hard to prove that the topic, both in the geographical sense of what West Asia, North Africa is, but also just in the sense of what military presence is, what substantially means, things like that it's hard to prove what exactly this topic would include. I think that means that a lot of people are going to have a very expansive, inclusive definition of what the topic means, which means that even a video like this, there's no way that we can get into all of the different intricacies and everything that the topic can handle because it's just beyond the scope of the hours that we could talk about. What I do want to do is I want to highlight a couple of things. The first thing I want to do is point you in the direction of this topicality video that I did. There's a free file in it. You should check it out if you're interested in topicality or just trying to get to know what the definitions on this topic are and haven't watched any of the other videos. But I want to point to a couple things that I think are important in that video. The two major T arguments that I think people will try to employ are kind of T military presence is only bases and troops. I think that the reason for this would just be like, hey, the topic's huge. We might as well just put some type of limit on it. I know it might be arbitrary. I know, that might exclude some things, but just based on how the world works, maybe we should just limit it a little bit. And I think that these teams will just try to sell the judges on, I know it's huge, but, maybe we should have fewer Affs because the topic is that huge. So I think that that's something to think about. I think the other thing to think about is topicality arguments that say this thing that you say is military presence is not military presence. I think this is going to be hard to prove if it's like a big core issue, but on topics like this, there have always been people who run to the fringes of the topic, and I think that that will be something that judges will try to put a limit on the topic if negative teams can kind of sell them on that limit of the topic. Two things that I want to note before I end on topicality is I think that the word in is interesting because I think rather than just say the whole resolution, say resolved, say, like some semantic things, I think that there might be some extra justifications for whole res. Now, I think that if we think about how this topic works with how people normally answer whole res, I don't think that that's like a game-changing, groundbreaking argument because the picks debate still has to be had, but I think that that's something that people can say if they want to say it. I think the other thing that's more interesting is I think a lot of Affs are probably going to be extra or effects topical. I think on a topic that has huge case list already, I think that maybe some judges will be willing to pull the topicality argument trigger here, but I'm still skeptical of this given the overall scope of the topic. So now I want to hand it over to Travis, who is going to talk about value criterion, and Phil.
Thank you, Scott. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the value criteria cases that you might see on the military presence. First, let's talk about some of the major values and criteria themselves that you're going to see. Then we'll talk a little bit about the contentions that are going to be common. Now, I'll be completely honest, I'm going to fly through this section because I already covered it in much greater detail in the traditional LD lecture for the military presence topic, and if you're interested in this stuff, you should go watch that video. And you can find that on my LD Coach YouTube channel. So go check that out because this is going to be a brief discussion. So what are some of the major values that you can use? Morality, as you can on every resolution, whether we're talking about utilitarian or consequentialist sort of framings or, deontological sort of perspectives of morality, gives you a preview of some of the criteria. Same thing is true with justice. Now, justice, all the forms of justice, whether you're talking about human rights, various international law forms of justice, whether you're talking about social justice, whether you're talking about environmental justice, indigenous justice, all the different types of justice can be applied to this resolution. Same thing is true with dignity and autonomy, which a lot of theorists and philosophers say are sort of the two twin pillars of the things that we need in order to be recognized as human. And so we need dignity, and military presence in a lot of ways erases the dignity of the local populations as well as those that are targeted by our military forces. And same thing is true with autonomy. If you don't have the ability to exercise your own decisions, then you don't really have the capacity for rational decision making, which some people say is key to morality, or lots of other things, sovereignty. And so there's a lot of good arguments in the affirmative about how U.S. military presence violates the autonomy of others. Now, on the flip side, on the neg, there are some compelling arguments that certain forms of humanitarian military presence are necessary because there are things that are denying dignity and autonomy to others, and that the just moral thing to do would be to, protect everybody. And then life. Skipped over that one, but that's a big one. Life is important itself inherently, but it's also important whether you're talking about other sorts of rights or other sorts of joys or other sorts of wonderful things. life itself is a prerequisite to accessing those things, as well as being a participant in other forms of morality or ethics. Now, life, just living, might not be good enough. Biological life, that is. You might also need value to life as well as quality of life. And those things can be argued are the paramount values on either the aff or the neg. Now, as far as criteria, you're going to see all the usual hits, whether it's utilitarianism, consequentialism, Kantian ethics, structural violence, slow violence. You're going to get a lot of the international law types criterion. So whether you're talking about international law itself, you can also be talking about the rule of law or human rights. Now, a unique aspect of this resolution is there's going to be a lot of moral and political philosophers that talk about just war theory and just war doctrines and the idea of what a just war is. And so there's a big question as to whether or not the military presence by the United States in the West Asia, North Africa region is meeting those definitions of just war. Now, what is a just war? It's up for debate, It's a pretty contentious discussion over hundreds of years. So it turns out lots of things are just or not just, depending on who you're reading. Now, another interesting aspect of this resolution where you can find some more unique, more pertinent, more specific form of criteria are different schools of international relations. In particular, there's a few mainstream schools of international relations. Now, whether or not you think they should or should not be, that's my discussion. I'm not an international relations theorist or scholar. You probably shouldn't even be listening to me if you want those types of discussions. I'm just letting you know what debate's going to talk about. And here's what debate's going to talk about. They're going to talk about those in the realist camp of international relations, which we're going to get into greater detail in the fill section here in a little bit, as well as some of those that are more ardent defenders of liberal international democracy and the liberal international order and various forms of that. So those types of major questions are going to be important as to deciding whether or not military presence are necessary and are good, whether or not they are in line with certain understandings of how states interact with each other, and whether or not U.S. military presence is right according to the way the world works and should work. Now, the final thing I want to talk about is alternative forms of ethics. There's a lot of different types of ethical understandings of the world other than just the, consequentialist or other types that we've discussed above. For instance, indigenous ethics, environmental ethics, more than human ethics, decolonial ethics, gendered ethics, there's ethics of care. There's a lot of different alternative forms of ethics. I'm not even giving you real specifics. I'm just saying a schmattering, because all of these forms of ethics are going to be good ways of measuring whether or not United States military presence is upholding values such as morality. And the moral thing to do is going to be follow these sort of ethical principles. And for instance, an ethic of care, would be one where the most ethical thing that you can do in any given instance is do what cares most for individuals. Now, again, there's going to be certain instances on either the aff or the neg where either side of the resolution can claim that the most caring thing to do would either be to reduce, maintain, change something to our military presence in the region. Again, if you want more details, go watch the other video. Contentions. We're going to go through this one pretty quickly as well. For the aff, all sorts of national security contentions. So terrorism. U.S. military presence right now is fomenting blowback that leads to terrorism. We see this by the way that a lot of different international terrorist organizations cite our military presence as a reason for them to do a lot of the things that they do. But in addition, our military presence in the region gets us involved in a bunch of different regional power politics. And you have some people out there who are pretty proficient in the cyber realm. And some of these state actors might retaliate against our military presence by doing cyber attacks against us at home. And so pulling our military presence out might decrease the need for those types of cyber attacks. And then, war happens because of our military presence. And I discussed that in greater detail in the other video. But, the basic principle is even if our military is not in the region as part of war and they're not doing war fighting, they are targets for other groups who want to take out the U.S. military, who want to demonstrate their resistance, who are building local support, who are acting as proxies for other state or other larger groups. Lots of reasons why people want to take pot shots at, the big invading military presence. And any one of those attacks, especially successful attacks, runs the risk of escalation, runs the risk of miscalculation, where you assume one thing happened but another thing happened, and then you make a decision believing one thing happened when another thing happened, and all of a sudden you attack the wrong people, or you attacked disproportionately, which can again lead to escalation. And since we are talking about proxies, all these groups who are attacking each other are related to other groups, funded by other groups, trained by other groups, including other states. And any time that you are engaging in proxy conflict, that runs the risk of dragging in the great powers behind it. So all of those are scenarios for national security that affirmatives can touch on, with a whole host of those different value criteria that we talked about in the previous slide. Now, aside from national security, there's also international security. So terrorism applies there. Our military presence promotes terrorism abroad as well, and also promotes it against our troops, which could lead to a lot of the scenarios discussed above. Now, our military presence is also, maybe not that helpful. We have long decades of a pretty clear track record that our presence in Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam did not exactly help stabilize anything. And in fact, a lot of people argue that it's made it far, far worse for everybody. The populations of those nations, the areas around it, the other nations, leads to migration, leads to just horrible conditions. Everything is destabilized. And again, wars, same sort of thing. All the scenarios above, very similar. Hegemony. Now, for the AF, you can argue that the United States military presence is part and parcel of an aggressive unipolar strategy where we feel that we need to be the world's global police, and that us pulling apart and pulling back might contribute to a more globalized society where we share in the burdens of these kind of police keeping type roles, and we can foster the transition from this unipolar world to a more multipolar world, and because lots of reasons, if we maintain this attempted unipolar world, then rivals like Russia or China, are gonna push up against us and eventually cause a war. And then also, there's a lot of arguments how our military presence in the region does not conform with international norms and international laws, and that us withdrawing our military presence or significantly reducing it, at least in the parts that contradict those international laws and norms, would help make us more in line with the liberal international order. What is the liberal international order? That means that where we accept liberal democratic norms internationally, and we work together in things like the UN in order to solve problems, rather than just being lone wolf nations that say, don't worry, we'll fix it on our own. Economy, that's also really important. Military presence, not cheap. We spend a lot of money on that, and every dollar that we are spending on the bombs and the bases and all the things necessary to sustain those things, the civilian contractors necessary to support those bases, all the stuffs, that is a massive strain on our domestic budget, which can contribute things to like debt, but also means that there's a trade-off where we're not, what we spend on a bomb is what we don't spend on a health care. And so those could be advantages, or conversely, what we don't spend in the region on bombs there or military presence there might be better used in other areas. And that's something that I was going to talk about in international security, but I kind of looped on. And that's the question of, if we reduce our military presence in that region, Can't they be used for other places better? Maybe we distribute our military resources better. And so that goes back to that point under international security contentions about wars, how we can do that. And then the environment. Climate change, military, big polluters. They pollute also. Burn pits, those are nasty. Biodiversity. Bombs don't only kill people, they kill everything. When there's military runoff, that goes into the oceans. The military, it kills marine mammals, it kills fish in pretty important biological areas too. So those are things that can also be considered when we're discussing whether or not to reduce our military presence. And then finally, violence and dehumanization. War is bad for your health. It's bad for everybody's health. But it is particularly bad for those that experience the violence disproportionately, and those that are already marginalized before they start experiencing the violence of war itself. Well, all of those things are compounded. And so reducing military presence that supports violence and dehumanization is going to be a large part of a lot of affirmatives on this year's topic. Now, the NEG. NEG also gets to talk about national security. They also get to talk about terrorism. Maybe our military presence in the region is necessary to take the fight to the terrorists themselves, where they are. Same thing with cyber. Same thing with war. Our military presence can actually deter aggressors. It can assure our allies and can actually kind of lead to the regional defense that we need to stop real threats. Now, I put deterrences and assurances there in italics and underlined because in my mind, this is going to be the most popular and one of the most strategic negative positions out there as it relates to all types of Affs, whether you're talking about critical Affs, whether you're talking about soft left Affs, no matter what type of Aff you're talking about, deterrences and assurances I think is going to be very, very important. Again, our military presence is necessary to assure our allies that we're there to help them no matter what, so that they don't take rash measures to protect themselves. And it's also necessary for deterrence because there are aggressors in the region or internationally who would love to take advantage of a power vacuum by a United States reduction. Italicized and underlined for a reason. Whether you're going to be talking about traditional cases, progressive, whatever. That's a big part of the neg. And then economy. Also get to talk about economy. So trade. While the AF can say that maybe we'll have better trade partners if we are seen as less aggressive, the neg can say, well, we need our military presence in order to protect important trade routes, whether we're talking about the Straits of Hormuz, the entire, Suez Canal, whatever. Big boats go through those places that carry a lot of important things. And our big boats with big guns protect those big boats with consumer goods. Now, also key to competitiveness, which basically means that we are going to have the most advanced economy in all the ways. And you know what? The thing about our military presence is that it not only helps protect that trade, but it also helps secure other markets for us so that we have more goods. And when we're competitive and when our economy is strong, that makes us seem very strong and contributes back to hegemony and other things up above. And then also resources. We need our military presence there. There's oil. There's oil in them, our hills, and our military can help us get it. Now, if you want to be benevolent, you can do that also on the neg. There's a lot of literature that talks about the reason why our military presence, not all of it in the region, but some of it, is necessary for humanitarian purposes. Again, this is, we're talking about a lot of places that have been disproportionately impacted by violence, particularly colonial violence, for hundreds of years. And so in that situation, a lot of the different wars that happen in these contexts compound upon each other. And there's lots of humanitarian crises abound, and some people say that the best way to deal with that is to actually have our military there in those humanitarian capacities. And so that's some ground that the neg can try and carve out, if you will. Let's talk about Phil. Let's talk about Kant on the aff and the neg. So in general, here's sort of the picture that everybody thinks when they think of the typical Kant approach to the topic. You know, the aff must win that a categorical imperative exists to reduce U.S. military presence. We must prove that the ought in the resolution means that the aff's burden means that we have to prove that this thing is moral and it must be universal moral and in every other instance and da-da-da-da-da. Okay, cool. You can do that. If you want to talk about that, I talk about that in a lot greater detail in the other video. So again, go to the traditional LD video on my LD Coach YouTube channel and you can watch that. That's one thing. Same thing with the neg. So if you're going to do the traditional Kant thing, another thing that you can do is you can say, 1, you can prove a categorical imperative does not exist to reduce military presence. You can be like, look, your burden is to prove that 1 does exist. You have to prove it is moral. If you don't, you lose. Okay. Or 2, you can just go the other route. Just prove a categorical imperative exists to maintain military presence. And the humanitarian stuff is a good place to look if you're really interested in some sort of Kantian justifications why U.S. military presence is necessary and moral. There's a broad discussion about humanitarian intervention and Kantian ethics. This is how a lot of y'all are going to do this, okay? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, plus I spent a whole video on that. Here's what you can also talk about, because here's what's important. Kant wrote about a lot of things. He didn't just write about the categorical imperative. Kant actually wrote about international relations. Kant actually wrote about militaries. And so don't you kind of want to know what he talked about? Well, we're going to do that for this little bit. And it's going to be really important because even if you don't want to talk about this Kant stuff, the team who's debating you can, and they can use it to generate links to their positions. So I'd pay attention. All right. One of the things that Kant wrote was this little essay called Toward Perpetual Peace. And it's a good title because the entire goal of that essay is to say, if we do these things, we can achieve perpetual peace, forever peace. Now, really what he's outlining here is what international relations people call democratic peace theory. And fundamentally, that's just democratic nations don't go to war with each other. Okay. Now, there's some obvious examples, considering we're talking about a democratic nation, the United States, with a vast military presence and a lot of conflicts. So, you know, it's up for debate. But the democratic peace theory and a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this slide also paves the way for other types of approaches like cosmopolitanism down the road, which was much more developed by Derrida, as well as some others, which I think are also going to be really important on this topic. All right. So what are the requirements for lasting peace? How do we get peace? Don't you want peace? I want peace. Everybody wants peace. So let's get it. 6 ways to get it. 6 things you need. Requirements. 1. Make treaties honestly and earnestly, which basically means when you make a treaty, don't do that while you're also thinking about how best to attack the person you're in a treaty with. Just like, you know, be forthright, which is a good rule of life. 2, don't annex territory of others. Okay, don't steal others' land. That's important. Now, also an interesting question when we think of things like settler colonialism or coloniality. We'll skip that for now. 3, don't interfere in other states' affairs, like their internal politics. The United States kind of does that all the time. Like, all the time. 4, abolish standing armies. That would definitely be in line with the topic. Pulling our military presence out would be in line with abolishing standing armies, because what Kant says is that if you have standing armies, or military presence per se, it always runs the risk of an arms race, which runs the risk of actual conflict. Then you need to limit foreign debt, because once you get too indebted to other nations, that's when power imbalance happens, and that's when conflict happens. And then finally, if you do have to go to war, don't commit atrocities, because that makes it much more likely that future conflicts are going to happen, because people don't forget those things. Now, if all of this sounds very smart and succinct, it's because I didn't come up with this. This is all from Assistant Professor Formosa, who is at the university, or Makara University. So I just did some interweb research. I'm not smart. Paul Formosa is smart. Okay. Now, unfortunately, these are not the only things that are going to just lead to perpetual peace. One of the other big things is these bonus requirements. What are they? Well, there's 3 other sets of rights that are important to make the others work and function that everybody kind of needs to buy into. So what are they? The first is the rights of citizens within states. Now, this also goes back to the other video where we talk about Kantian approaches to the state of nature. It's kind of anarchy, yes, but the best way to deal with that is through coercion and not force, which means we should use the law. International, we should, create republics, and democratic republics in particular. All right. And citizens should have some fundamental rights and things like that. And yay, you should be a democratic republic with fundamental rights for all of your citizens. That's the first thing. Second, states have rights themselves versus other states. And this is where the democratic peace theory comes in, but also really comes into like, okay, if state of nature is true on an individual level, how does that play out then for the international system? Well, if it's kind of anarchy, if we were just out in the world by ourselves, same is true for nation states. Okay? And so how did people respond to it according to Kant? Well, we use coercion instead of force, which means we form laws and social contracts and states. Same thing is true on the international level. We form international federations. Okay? And this is where it kind of then starts the basis towards liberal international order type thinking, and how those types of supranational structures are pretty good ways of resolving conflict. And then, finally, what about those that don't quite have a state? What about migrants? What about displaced populations? Well, Kant says all of them have rights too. And that is where he really comes up with his cosmopolitan ethics hospitality. Now, like I said, Derrida takes cosmopolitanism a lot further and sort of combines that with the notion of this liberal international order and creates a more robust picture of what an ethical international relations would look like and how it would work to create a lasting peace. Now, of course, there's other people who disagree with this, and that's the Hobbesians, all right? Hobbes was at odds with Kant and said, yeah, it is anarchy, but no, it's not coercion. You can't talk your way around a bear. It's about force. And you know what? What we can do is we can ally ourselves with others in a social contract so that we can work as a group to take down that bear. And so force, social contract, how does that play out on the international level? Yeah, sure, we can have treaties or something, but might is right. So it's security guarantees and assurances, and we're only going to do it with people who are in our best interest to work with, because it's anarchy out here, and I got to get mine and you got to get yours. And we got to do that on the individual level, but also at the state level. And this then bubbles up to the realist school of international relations, which is a really, really, really important concept as we talk about the critical stuff and approaches to how to answer this topic in soft left Affs, and we get to later slides. But for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Scott.
Thanks, Travis. I want to start the Affs section by just noting that because of what I have previously talked about in the intro and the topicality part, I think that it's really hard, exceptionally hard, impossible to be comprehensive in this portion of the topic lecture, because I think a lot of people are just going to search for doing something different. They're going to change their affirmative a lot, and that because of the expansive scope of the topic, it's really hard to say these are going to be all of the plans or Affs on this topic. So I want to start with that note. The second note that I want to say when we start to get into the sort of contention areas, and I'm going to be brief here, is this is also really hard because every contention can kind of be an aff argument and it can be a neg argument. And I think that because of this, smart affirmatives are going to try to take the negative's best arguments, like deterrence, assurance, things like that, which I'm going to get into later when I flip to talking about the negative, but they're going to try to take that as their advantage instead, just to try to beat the negative to those debates. So I think that you're going to see that a lot. I also think that you're going to see this because of the reduction versus not an increase part of the topic, where, for instance, if you look at hegemony on the topic, an affirmative could say a hegemony argument that would say the footprint of the military for the US is too expansive now. It needs to be refocused, and that refocusing by decreasing the footprint in West Asia, North Africa would solve retrenchment, sort of solve the bad things that have come with hegemony, the backlash, all sorts of things that come with that, with bases. And I think that that will be an angle that a lot of people who are really bent on saying hegemony will say on this topic. I also think those same people even will say this on the negative, where they're going to say, no, we need that presence because that hard power, that military presence is key to deter our enemies like Russia, China, Iran in the region, and key to assure our allies in the region. So I think that that is a good example of how this debate can just kind of happen on both sides, and I think it'll be interesting to play out over the course of the topic which sides of this are more strategic for each for both the aff and the neg, because I think that this will determine some of the arguments on the topic. I'm not going to get into the prolif debate right now, but I think with arguments concerning proliferation that it's largely the same as hegemony, where both the aff and the neg are going to argue this, because there's just different authors who disagree, have different access points to these same arguments on the topic. So that's kind of where I'm going to leave off with the aff advantage areas before I get into some more specific affs. What I do want to note, if you're like, Scott, that was like two things, I want to just point you in the direction of Travis's traditional topic lecture, because Travis has 3 slides where he goes through all of these different contention areas that I have listed here, and we'll link that lecture below in the description. But if you're just interested in like advantage areas rather than you can read this specific affirmative, I would really point you in this direction, because I think that that will be better for what you want to view the topic as, or where you want to go with your case, rather than where the direction or scope of this video is going. So let's get into some actual affirmatives on the topic. I want to stop off again. I know I sound repetitive here. Maybe I wasn't the most word efficient speaker in debate, but this is not comprehensive. There's just going to be so many affirmatives, so many weapons, so many bases. You know, I kind of started here with the X country aff. Just think of the X as any country you want to put in the topic. And I think that if you can think that that thing is a thing on the topic, then it's probably a thing on the topic. So, I know this is kind of nebulous, and like you said, you were going to say specific things, but just note that there's going to be so many different affs that talk about not only specific countries, but specific presence within those countries, that's going to be a popular style of affirmative on the topic. So I just started with that. An affirmative that I think is going to be popular is the Turkey TNWs argument. So TNWs stands for tactical nuclear weapons. The United States has nuclear weapons forwardly deployed in 5 different NATO nations, and Turkey is one of those nations. Traditionally on past topics, both on 2 different military presence topics, a college nukes topic, and other topics, this has been a really popular area to debate. There's tons of literature, and I would be shocked if people do not read this affirmative, just given the scope of that. The second affirmative that I think will be popular will be affirmatives that talk about Iraq and or Syria. I think that these affirmatives are going to be really popular, especially in the wake of the killing of the Iranian leader Soleimani. I'm not sure his exact title, but President Trump killed him in January of 2020 in a targeted assassination attack as he left the Baghdad airport. And as backlash for that, Iran attacked al-Assad air base in Iraq with a bunch of missiles, and that made all sorts of headlines over the United States. So I think that this will be a area of the topic that a lot of people are drawn to, just based on how much this is in the news and how much that after the Israel-Gaza crisis war, that this has become a big sort of proxy consequence of that. I also think this is outside the sort of policy scope of the topic, but in the past when this has been debated, there have been a lot of topics that have talked about Iraq in terms of colonialism, and I think that a lot of affirmatives, even if they're a policy aff that like removes troops from an airbase in Iraq, will have really good link turns against a lot of critiques. I think this is alluding to the fact, maybe this isn't the best K topic, that will be really good offense for even policy affs. I think some other affirmatives in terms of certain countries to think about are Kuwait. In the past, I know I sound repetitive here, this has been somewhere that has been sort of debated about in terms of our presence. The main reason for this is that a lot of the United States' airlift capacity comes out of Kuwait, so it kind of like facilitates the infrastructure, the airlift for the rest of the region. When I was researching the topic lecture part of this topic, a lot of it said that if you are sent somewhere in the Middle East, you're sent to Kuwait first. So I think that that's something interesting to think about. I think you might see some affirmatives talk about Qatar as well, especially with Al Udeid Air Base. There's a lot of really good literature, especially when Trump was in administration, because he threatened to leave this base and just said that we could relocate it somewhere else in the Middle East. Now, that might be a different topicality debate, but I think that that is something certainly worth noting. Now, I could point out a lot more countries here, and I'm going to get to the North Africa part of the topic in a second, but this video could just be like 3 hours long if I talked about all of the different countries and things that I think could be at this topic. So I'm just going to leave that out of this. What I do want to talk about and stop off at is I think that there's some different like branches or forces arguments that people will read. In the past, people have made all sorts of arguments about the Navy. The Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. I think some people could definitely talk about Bahrain, especially. I think that they could also talk about aircraft carriers. The United States currently has 2 aircraft carriers in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. This would probably be classified as part of the topic, but I'm going to talk about this in a second because I think this might not be T. I know I said that, there's no limit to the topic, but I think that this might be one of the only ones. The last part of the Navy is there's a bunch of stuff going on in Yemen, off the coast of Yemen. I think that that would be a really interesting angle on the topic as well. Special operations or forces, I think that this would be a real good or real popular affirmative on the topic. Would have a really good angle because it's like secret and covert, but I also think it will be strategic because people will like end a mission or stop doing special ops in a specific place. And while that might not be substantial or a reduction, I think that a lot of judges will let affirmative teams get away with plans like that. So I think that that will be something also that affirmatives could read as a plan. The last portion here that I want to talk about is different branches. So in the past on military topics, just like people have read Navy AFs. They've also read things like the Coast Guard. Maybe there'll be a Space Force AF. I read one article that was like Middle Eastern countries want Space Force co-op. I don't know what that looks like because it's in the opposite direction of the topic. Maybe it's a DA, but just some things to think about. Some more planned affirmatives that I want to talk about are, I think people will definitely talk about Israel. I think that Israel is way beyond the scope of this video or anything that I'm going to talk about. But in terms of our military presence, I think these affirmatives are going to be hard because our presence is kind of vague or ambiguous. I think maybe these affirmatives will tilt towards the like military cooperation, arms sales part of the topic. People in the past have read like ban the Iron Dome style affirmatives, so maybe we'll see something like that. I also think you could see affirmatives talk a lot about the Gaza war here, but I'm not exactly sure how U.S. military presence would work there. They'd probably have to have some other access point, like decrease in a different place, and then that would mean Israel isn't assured in the war and pulls out or something like that. But I think that absent something like that, I just really haven't looked into the Israel part of the topic as much yet. I do want to stop off and talk about North Africa for a second. I think there's at least 2 really good AFs here. I think that there will be a Somalia AF. In the past, people have read this as both a piracy affirmative and they have read it as a Al-Shabaab terror affirmative. I think people will say that what we're doing is ineffective now and that we just need to get out. I know that this would sound like a negative argument, like we need to increase the presence because it's a bad thing. But I think that people will probably try to go in the opposite direction. I think that people will also read a Djibouti AF. I think in addition to saying just kind of like the normal stuff on the topic, I think that this affirmative is particularly interesting because when you watch, or if you watched the lecture that I did on the topic overall, China and the US are definitely competing for influence in Djibouti and have military bases that are really, really, really close to one another. So I think that that might be something that smart affirmatives will take advantage of. I also want to note before I'm done talking about the specific countries is that there's definitely Turkey AFs that are beyond TNWs, and I want to stop here as a stopping point for all of these different countries. It's just a note that like the US has tons of presence in Turkey. There's tons of different things that you could say. I have a inkling suspicion that somebody's going to read arguments that talk about NATO and Turkey. And I just think that that's a good example of how expansive the topic is. I also think if you look at this topic from like a categories perspective, before I get into that a little bit more, I think that there will be a ton of small AFs on the topic. I think North Africa is probably a good example of this, where people will be like, we have a secret drone base in Cyprus and we should get rid of that. And that has these really little kinetic war impacts that outweigh. And I think that there will be tons of affirmatives that do things like that. And it will be hard to beat because they'll be like, oh, well, that's all our presence in Algeria, or that's all our presence in Cyprus. And we meet, so it's 100%. I also think that on the same line that there will be tons of AFs that just get rid of a specific type of weapon, type of ship, something like that, that is provocative to some other country. So while this isn't comprehensive, I think this is a pretty good idea of some of the AFs that people are going to read on the topic. Before I end talking about affirmatives, I do want to talk about AFs that I think might not be T, but because the topic is so big, people might read them. First is arms sales. I think that this could be definitely something that's popular. I definitely have some definitions in that Topicality video that say that it is a part of the topic. And I think that this is a good example of how big this topic is, because arms sales to West Asia, North Africa could literally be its own topic. So, and it kind of was in policy debate a couple years ago. So I think that this is something that people could take advantage of. Also, probably why there's no case list for, what is and isn't topical on this topic. Some things that, might not be, though. I did find this really good definition that I put above here of carriers not being topical. So I think that this would probably apply to an AF that would like get the carriers that the US deployed in support of Israel out of the Eastern Med. I think that AF just like, sure, the topic's big, but I think it just might not be T. I think that a CIA or FBI AF might also be a good example of this. So I remember when this topic was debated in 2010, 2011, but with a different case list that included Afghanistan and Japan and South Korea, that our only win at the Harvard round robin was against a CIA covert drugs AF, where the judge was like, I know the topic's big, but like this just isn't it. So I also think for those small AFs that you think are strategic and linked to and everything, that maybe you might have a judge who just says this isn't it, this isn't T, this isn't what you're looking for. I think that could be also the case with the PMCs AF, private military corporations that started in Iraq with Blackwater. There's tons more now. I think that one of the problems with this might be that the topic says it's, and that people will use that to say that it's not the military presence. But I think there's a really good argument to be made that like the contracts they sign mean it is, all sorts of things like that. But I think that there's all sorts of things like this that people could read on the topic. The last thing that I want to leave you with is I just tried to put some of these AFs into categories to try to think about what this topic looks like, because there's no way I can say all the AFs on this topic in one video. And I think that you could think about dividing military presence up into things that are physical and virtual. I'm not sure if you'd use these things for like a topicality distinction, but I do think that you could use these to think about what different AFs could be and could utilize on the topic. I'm not going to talk about all these extensively. The only thing that I do want to talk about is on a past topic when we debated this, the team that won the TOC and the team that was just like, I don't know, like 150 and 10 on the topic or something ridiculous like that, read a affirmative that was probably the most popular affirmative called the coin affirmative. And that affirmative changed the counterinsurgency mission that the United States had in Afghanistan. And the reason that it was so strategic is that it changed the mission, and that led to a reduction rather than actually like physically removing the presence. So I think that is an interesting way to think about affirmatives on this topic. And I'm going to do a whole video on just like past debating of this topic. But I think that that's something interesting to think about in terms of what AFs can and cannot be on the topic. So now that I've talked about AFs, I'm going to flip it over to the neg side of the topic. Starting with the neg side and disadvantages, I think that there's just like a couple disads that there will be different versions of, but I think will be the strongest neg arguments for teams that try to emulate policy debate on this topic. I think the first thing will be the deterrence disad. U.S. forces in the region, whichever ones they decide to withdraw, obviously having a specific link would be good, are important because they deter someone in the region. I think that there's going to be generic versions of this disad that are just like deterrence is good, but I also think there's going to be versions of this that deal with specific countries in terms of deterring them. Now, what I want to make a distinction between is that there's going to be a similar disad in nature, but instead of deterring enemies, it is going to assure allies. So I think that there's going to be lots of different disadvantages that are going to be some version of the assurance disad that is going to say the United States presence is important because it upholds our commitment to allies, and without having that commitment, that our allies are going to do things that are going to be bad, like invade countries, get nuclear weapons, turn to Russia and China, all sorts of different things like that. I think that these could also take the shape of different proliferation disads. So you could see a prolif disad that might be a lot like an assurance disad that are going to have lots of different scenarios that are going to be similar. But I think that they'll try to get to these scenarios in different ways. So, for instance, I think an assurance scenario with Saudi Arabia would say that the U.S. withdrawal would incentivize them to proliferation or to prolif. I think that the same would be true with Iran, and you could see a Saudi DA that would work with this, that would say withdraw emboldens Iran to get the bomb, and not only would that be bad, but it would also cause Saudi Arabia to get the bomb, and that would be bad. So I think that those are two different scenarios that you could look at. I also think that there's going to be versions of this with Israel. Obviously, Israel doesn't acknowledge that it has nuclear weapons, but I think that there could be scenarios where, they could do something like that. They could do a nuclear test, something like that, in the wake of the U.S. substantially reducing its presence. I also think that on these topics, people have always read all sorts of different scenarios for different countries. So you might see Kuwait prolif, Jordan prolif, Egypt prolif, Djibouti prolif. I'm not really sure, but I just think you will see a lot of different scenarios for different countries like this. I also think that this is true for the terror disads. So obviously, people are going to make the argument that withdrawal is going to cause a fill-in of not only countries like Iran, China, Russia, other players in the region, but could also lead to the fill-in of terrorists. So I think that there's a really good precedent here of when the United States withdrew from Iraq previously, that the presence was filled in by ISIS. And I think that people will use that rationale to read terror disadvantages on the topic. The problem with this is that there's really good precedent after Afghanistan that the U.S. withdrawal was filled in by the Taliban, who have been stopping terrorism. So I think that this will also depend on like regional actors and things like that, and probably also just assumes that the U.S. doesn't have other presence in the region that's not like boots on the ground that's capable of striking terrorists. So I think that those are some core disads on the topic. I think that there will also be some other disads that will be really popular. I think that sort of a location shift disad will be popular and has been on past topics. So for instance, if you take the troops, where do they go? I don't think that, the affirmative can just mandate a reduction. So those troops would have to go elsewhere. I think that, there's a lot of arguments to be made on past topics that troops have been deployed to places like Guam or other places in Asia in this shift from a reduction in one place to another. Obama was pretty famous for this with his quote-unquote Asia pivot, but there hasn't been a lot of literature or a lot of, good stuff on that sense. I think that people will also read a Ukraine version of this that could be pretty popular. I also think that people will read like a weapons shift DA, I'm going to call this. So kind of like if we withdraw troops, that will cause increase in drone strikes. I've read a lot of things that say that bases will be replaced by like over the horizon capabilities. So like we don't need troops on the ground to kill terrorists because we have drones that can fire missiles and operated from hundreds of miles away, so it's not as big of a capacity risk to the United States. And I think that people will say this shift is bad because it causes resentment, increases terrorism, all hosts of other things, maybe some Iraqi internal politics stuff. And I think that that would be a really interesting angle for a lot of people to go on the topic, but it will be a shift to more than just that. I think that you might also see people read like trade-off disads with this. So like, a reduction in military presence would lead to a increase in some other thing because the United States would have more money, and that money would lead to some other thing being passed. I know in past topics it's like an increase, so we'd call this like a trade-off DA. So I don't know what like the trade-in DA is or something like that, but in the past people have said before the F-35 program was completed, they'd say like any military increase led to a cutoff in F-35s. So maybe people will say a reduction will lead to inclusions of things like anti-ballistic missiles and lasers and space things and all sorts of things that might be included in the topic. I also think that there will be a whole host of military DAs. I think that this is probably outside the scope of what I'd like to talk about for disads, but I just want to note that on past military topics, CMR or civil military relations has been a big thing because the president and the Secretary of Defense are civilians who interface with the military and are in charge of the military, and that interaction between them is something that has been up for debate in terms of who has the power and who is consulted and all sorts of things like that. And I think that it will also be particularly interesting on this topic for that in the wake of a bunch of military appointments now actually happening now that an ex-football coach has stopped blocking them. So I think that that will be an interesting part of the topic. And speaking of politics, I think that there will definitely be a ton of politics disads on this topic. I also, I don't know what those are going to be. I also think that people will start to debate the 2024 elections disad more. Not sure the link is as good as people will think it is, but I think that people will account for this or kind of, strategically make up for this by just reading scenarios about different primaries, different things that make these disads a lot better than they probably should be. So that's what I've got to say about disads on the topic. Now that I've finished talking about disadvantages, I want to stop off and talk about case for a second. On other topics, you'd see a slide here that says like no solvency, circumvention, things like that are more defensive in nature. But I have an inkling on this topic that, given the way it's been debated in the past, that this is likely to be a topic where a lot of teams say different impact turns. So if your affirmative says hedge is good, I could see people saying hedge bad. If your affirmative says prolif is bad, I could see the negative saying proliferation is good. Even in terms of different war impacts, I definitely think that Middle East war, whether that's good or bad, will be debated. Russia, China, Iran, everything you name it has probably been debated in the past in terms of how kinetic and international these war-based relations topics that directly interface with the military for util style impacts rather than tangentially have led to these style of arguments being more pervasive and more persuasive. So I think that you could see that as well as just all sorts of different relation scenarios as well. I think a lot of people will talk about the US-Saudi deal and relations. I could see people impact turning that. In the past, US-Russia relations have been impact turned. So I think absent just like the normal case defense style of arguments, you will see a lot of people, maybe like advantage counterplan out of one advantage, impact turn the other for 6 minutes. And I think in LD, where there's a time imbalance, I think that a lot of negative teams might find that as a more strategic access point to the ballot than like actually trying to argue the nitty-gritty specific details of the affirmative in the debate. Speaking about the nitty-gritty details of the affirmative, I think that one thing to note is that this topic in the past, especially when it was debated in college a couple years ago, was a case negs topic. So what that means is somebody reads a specific aff, you have a very specific strategy just for that team. And that is how, in the past, college debated these topics, because it's really hard to have generic disadvantages and counterplans and positions against really, really, really specific affirmatives. So I'm going to have a different video where I go through all of some of the past topics that we've debated, some of the files, some of the arguments, things like that. But I just wanted to note for this video that I think that a lot of teams are going to read case negs, and I also think that this is going to be a strategic note for Affs, because if you break a new Aff, it's real hard to read a specific case neg. So those are some things to think about in terms of, case negs, but also a strategic perspective for how to use these when prepping the topic. The last thing I want to talk about before I hand it off to Travis to talk about the critical stuff is counterplans. I think that this could be like 10 slides, and I only kept it to one because I talked a lot about disadvantages, but I think that you could just have every counterplan that's really, really quote unquote like cheaty or abusive in debate that could get read. And I think that this is kind of like a process counterplan debaters like dream of a topic, because you could just read any of these. I think some great examples of these could be consult and agent counterplans. I know agent counterplans, not as processy as others, but I think for consult counterplans for military things, NATO has always been consulted, the Joint Chiefs, maybe people outside the region want to be consulted. So I noted like the shift DA to Asia before. Maybe countries like Japan and South Korea want to be consulted because their presence is coming their way and they want to make sure that that doesn't make North Korea more aggressive or something like that. I also think that agent counterplans are going to be really important. There are a lot of debates between who's in charge of the military, whether or not Congress approves it, the executive is the commander-in-chief, and all of that type of stuff. I think that there will be a lot of debates about who's in charge of the troops, and I think a lot of negative teams will be able to smartly say that, one side will be sufficient enough to solve the other. I think that also in in instances, kind of like the past topic where like the national government only had authority, so an abusive counterplan would delegate that authority to the states. I think you might see some counterplans that do something like that on this topic too. I do want to note off that for picks, that if I was reading a whole res aff, like a lot of people have been doing this year in progressive debate, I would probably beware of this, because I think that these types of affirmatives are really susceptible to picks that just say this one country or this one type of presence is good. I also think like countries that wholesale get rid of presence in one region or one country will fall susceptible to the same problem, because they'll say, leave this brigade behind or leave this tank behind or something like that. So I think that that's something to think about when you're constructing counterplans. The last thing I wanted to note is that counterplans don't always have to interface with like the AF. I think that you'll see a lot more uniqueness style counterplans that increase presence or increase deterrence or increase assurance to try to increase the veracity of the link or the scenario that they're making for the disadvantage in the debate. So that's what I've got to say about the disad and counterplan portion of the topic. Now I'm going to hand it off to Travis, who is going to do critiques and critical affs on the topic.
Thank you, Scott. We're going to be finishing up with a critical discussion of this resolution. Now, this is a great resolution for critical debaters, but it's also a really hard resolution for critical debaters. It's really lopsided depending on which side of this thing you are on. And which side is it bad for? It's the neg. It's going to be a really hard resolution for K debaters. And there's two reasons. The first is that most critical authors just agree with the sentiment of the resolution. They too want to reduce U.S. military presence in the region, which means the second thing is true, that the perm probably just solves most links to the AF. So in a world where you debate just as well as the affirmative team, and they have a case that's doing what it's supposed to do, and y'all debate just as well, and it's the perm versus the alt, tie's probably going to go to them because they're probably on the side of the truth, which is not a good place to be on if you're the neg. So what do you do about it? Well, you quit. No! You don't quit. All right? Here's what you do. First, you got to realize that you're debating the perm, not the 1AC. I don't care what the 1AC says. They're not going to be going for the 1AC plan text in the 2AR. They're going to be going for the permutation. So construct your shell accordingly. Write a shell that's answering that permutation and that explanation that you're going to see in the 2AR, not what they say in the 1AC. And another approach, which is near and dear to my heart, is if it's going to be hard to win that the permutation doesn't solve the alt or the residual links, well, just make your alternative something that is mutually exclusive. If it is something that the aff and the alt can't do at the same time, definitionally, well, perm ain't going to happen. So there you go. That's a simple thing to do. How do you do that? Well, that's a little tricky. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay. We're going to start with the neg since that is the harder side of the resolution to be on. Now, one of the tried and true criticisms of any international relations topic is the security K. Now, what is the security K? The security criticism is, honestly, it's a lot of things, but it stems from a school of international relations back in the 80s, from the Copenhagen school, where some theorists got together and said that the way that we think about security in international relations in terms of just big boom, big conflicts, big military is wrong. And we need to think about other things that are not traditionally considered security as a part of what real security is. And those things include things like, food, well-being. And so that then also led us to consider some other things. Well, okay, if true security is not these things, then, what is the nature of those things? Well, some other theorists then started talking about then, okay, well, if true security means having essentials, these other types of insecurity, what are the makeup? Why do we fear them so much? What's going on there? Should we prioritize them as much? And a lot of different theorists then started to take this work of the Copenhagen school and then started putting it on their own. And then gendered theorists started thinking about this. And then other sorts of IR theorists started thinking about this. And the reason why I bring this up is what is the security K? It's a lot of things. The security K can be so many things in debate. But what it functionally says is that when you predicate the purpose of the state as one in protecting security, and when you treat international relations as a sphere in which the nation state needs to protect the security of its citizens, that then shapes the kind of world that we're living in and how we view other actors and how we view what kind of responses are and are not legitimate in that world. And where we start to view everything through this lens of security, well, the only thing that matters then are our fears of other international actors, as opposed to fearing things like the insecurity of our citizens from having things like food or having things like water or healthcare, childcare, basic things like that. And so there's a lot of different things that can be brought up with the security K. It can be something along the lines of threat construction, where identifying particular nations as threats against our own nation causes us to subconsciously act in manners that eventually results in them being threats to us. Because if we think they're a threat, well, we're going to start acting all hard around them, be like, oh, we're going to keep our guard up. Got it, they're a threat. And then they're going to be like, whoa, are they trying to square up with us? And then they're going to be all defensive too. And then it's going to be ratcheting up this situation into what we call a security dilemma, where both nations have this other understanding of each other that's predicated in this mutual fear of the other, so that actions are always going to be misperceived in this securitized sort of trap where it's all going to be viewed as aggression. And so security K, again, it's a lot of things. It's the security K is one of the greatest Franken Ks of all time because every critique author in international relations says something about security. So you say like security bad, and then like throw them all together, and then you can answer everything. It's fantastic. But anyway, so a lot of good critical positions typically for the security K can say that we can just reject this notion of security altogether or focus on other types of security. Like I said, the more human-centered security of like, do you have basic sustenance? Things like that. Are you peace at home and, peaceful and not scared of cops kicking down your door? Those types of peace. So the security K is going to work really well against a lot of soft left and hard left and like hard right affs. Soft left affs could be very difficult, however, depending on if they're written well or not. And we'll talk about that later. Now, aside from the security K, the pessimisms. And there's a lot of different types of pessimisms, whether we're talking about Afro-pessimism, whether we're talking about, the various pessimistic alternatives associated with settler colonialism, or we're talking about like queer pests or trans pests or crit pessimism. There's a lot of different pessimisms, and the idea that we can make the world better simply by removing United States military presence is a laughable concept. And these are good examples of mutually exclusive alternatives, potentially, depending on how you articulate them. There are various understandings of these pessimisms and alternatives, that are the best way to deal with the horrible state of nature is to just kind of let it all play out. And instead of trying to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic and pull out our military presence, let's just let it happen and do something in the face of that. And there's a lot of different ways of what that looks like. Oftentimes it's, community care networks. It's, it's a lot of things, but it's not this policy action of the AF. Then there's a lot of gendered IRKs. Now, this also includes gendered IR. So there's like the feminist IR schools, but that's been built upon. And then there was the queer IR move, and then that's being built upon in recent years. And now there's the trans IR move. So I'm going to put gendered IRs because there's a lot of different variants of gendered understandings of international relations. But they all have a few different common strands. One, they do develop from the security K and say that there's other forms of security that are paramount to these constructed fears of international actors. Like, we should really be prioritizing this, security of ourselves. We should be prioritizing, exactly like the types of things that are traditionally excluded from international relations, like food, water, but also being free from gendered violence, being free from, violence based on sexual identity. Those are the types of security that we should be concerned with, rather than, is North Korea going to nuke us? And there's a lot of different approaches within those varied schools, and there's a lot of different critiques. Now, a lot of those are going to be very permeable. I'll be completely honest with you, okay? Depending on what you're doing, unless you also have a robust critique of the state, which a lot of them do offer. So if you are thinking about the gendered IRKs, I would lean heavily into the ethics-based alternatives, because then you can claim that your alternative is a prerequisite to the permutation, or else it's going to turn out an unethical perm. That would be my best approach. Now, Orientalism is also really important. That's based on the works of Edward Said, who is a fantastic English professor, who talked about our understanding of the Orient. He was writing about the region that we're covering here today, is filled with these Orientalist notions. On one hand, it's this exotic other that we fetishize. Also, it's a wild and dangerous place filled with magical, irrational people. And a lot of our justifications for why we do things in our policies can sometimes retain Orientalist justifications or logics or representations, even if they meant to be good. Now, that was a long-handed way of saying the AF can be good, but we can still use bad representations or justifications, especially if you were talking about instances of instability. Remember how I went on that big long thing talking about destabilization and destabilized society? Those are often Orientalist tropes that depict, other places, far off places, as backward and chaotic and in need of the civilizing hand of the United States. And so if those things are present in the AF, even if they're pulling out military presence, those Orientalist justifications still linger and remain and shape our foreign policy so that we just merely redeploy our troops in other places or even in more nefarious ways, because the Orientalism at the heart of that is still true. Set colonization and decolonization, we're talking about a part of the world that has been colonized and decolonized and colonized again in many different ways. Settler colonial theorists are now just beginning to grapple with a lot of the other different nations. There's a lot of stuff that talks about Israel and Palestine within settler colonial literature. If that's something you're into, you can definitely look into that. But there's other settler colonial authors who are now looking at other nations and other situations within the West Asian, North African region as, a good analytic for settler colonial analysis as well. So if you want that, that's there too. But if you don't want to be in set call, you could also be in the decall or the coloniality stuff, because that also applies as well. There's lots of discussions of various forms of decolonial resistance, whether we're talking about Algeria and Fanon or other different types of groups. Capitalisms. There's a lot of them, and they all apply here. So extractive capitalism, resource capitalism, we use the Middle East for these types of resource things, but there's also a racial capitalism element to all of this, because there is a racialized notion to who we target as a threat, to who is and who is not a terrorist, to, where we conduct these sorts of things. I mean, lots of places have oil. Why are we going there? And so partly this Orientalism that we discussed up above also plays part and parcel into the racial capital structuring of the world, because Orientalism, settler colonialism, and anti-blackness are used to pit populations against each other so that white supremacy can reign supreme and the racial capitalist order can just continue to keep on profiting. So that is definitely worthy of examination as to why our military presence is there. Critical geopolitics is also important in terms of talking about bordering and offering alternatives, because reducing military presence is one thing, but that's not necessarily going to solve the harms of the case, because other people might fill in. Because even if the United States doesn't just come in and attack again, what if other people fill in the region, because there's a power vacuum? And so critical geopolitics would look at the reasons why the crises exist in the North Africa, West Asia region, and would attribute it to border making and border type logics and the types of map making logics that we have that are steeped in colonial, understandings of the world. And really, the United States and the resolution, by still focusing on military presence in specific areas, specific places, and being tied to specific geographical configurations, is still operating within those map-making and cartographical logics that kind of created the entire problem in the first place. Because these borders, they didn't care about culture, they didn't care about ethnicity, they didn't care about religion, they didn't care about race, they didn't care about ancestry, they didn't care about anything. And so when these colonial borders were put down, bad things happened. So critical geopolitics would say that the best basis for analysis would start there, with those maps. Now, psychoanalysis. This is a good way to get some mutual exclusivity with the affirmative, because they're going to be afraid of a lot of different things. There's going to be a lot of anxiety in that 1AC. Look at this scary thing that's happening. Look at this scary thing that's happening. We implore you to act. But here's the fundamental truth of the resolution. It's a resolution for a bunch of high school debaters who are not actually going to be engaging in these real policies. So we're still just some people in a debate round. So why is it that you felt the need to create this anxiety-producing text surrounding international relations? What does that say? Can we unpack that a little bit? Are there some interesting sort of things that we can learn by a psychoanalytic reading of the various desires and fears located within the text and performance of the affirmative? I think so. And as an alternative, there's a lot of different ways to do that. Maybe from, if you're so scared of your fear, let's let it happen. See how we feel about it then. Maybe we can work through our feelings if we just sit with it a little bit. Now, that is something that some theorists talk about in actually imagining these catastrophes to come true. Because again, hey, this is a debate round. These scenarios, while they do have some sort of representation to reality, what we're talking about in this specific instance, voting neg doesn't necessarily somehow make the affirmative scenario more likely. It's just a debate round. There's a ballot. But maybe there's some value in imagining the worst case scenario and seeing if we can have a new ethical relationship that develops out of that. Okay, criticisms of simulations. Again, kind of the idea with psychoanalysis, instead of trying to critique the idea of reducing military presence, let's critique the idea of pretending to reduce military presence. Why are you saying that you can do that? So you're going to simulate foreign policy? You're going to simulate the United States federal government doing something? You're going to simulate military policy? Why are you doing that? So there's a lot of different ways to do that, whether we're talking about the academy, so there is, critiques of simulated policy making. There's the Baudrillard stuff that's, talking about how entire wars did or did not happen based on our media understanding of things. There's also critiques of, pretending that we can control foreign policy and maybe instead we should be focusing on local forms of politics and resistance. And then, of course, the academy decay, we're not doing anything. Why do we pretend that this activism here in not even the university, the high school is going to do anything? Why is our high school activism in Lincoln Douglas going to tear down the United States structures? And there's probably some pretty good arguments that maybe that just gets co-opted. And then there's this whole other thing, the Schmittians. So if you want to troll around on Damien's wiki, you can see a bunch of Schmidt stuff. This has been around for a long time. There's even some lectures by some people on some old websites about college debate that are all about Schmidt. And the idea is that enmity is good. Sometimes it's good to have an enemy. It keeps you on your toes. To have an us versus a them kind of lets you know that there's an I and it makes you feel alive. And sometimes it just works out a little, kind of like mutually assured destruction. If I know that there's someone who I am really, 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 really scared of, and I know they're really, 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 really scared of me, well, maybe we're just going to act right and we're not going to do the things that cross each other, tip each other over the edge. So it leads to an unstable peace. And so maybe instead of trying to withdraw our military presence and create, this cooperative atmosphere, no, let's embrace the enmity. Let's keep them there. Maybe it's an argument. Some have made it. You can? We all have choices in life. You do you. You do you. Okay. Critical aff positions. I'm not going to go through this in greater detail because honestly I think it's pretty easy. Now the soft left affs, literally you can just take any of the Ks that you're used to and just slap it on there. I told you that almost all of your critical authors love the resolution or the concept of it. So you can use that to your advantage. Just kind of say, we're doing this in the name of K. And it works. You can do that for all the gendered stuff. You can do it for a lot of things. Now, all you have to do is defend why it is that we should actually pretend to reduce military presence. That is a starting point conversation, but there's ways around that. You can do it. So other types of soft left affs that are gonna, other than just Mad Lib K plus plan text, you can do anti-basing movements. There's pretty strong social movements all around the world where it's like United States military presence is problematic and the AF can actually spur and mobilize those. Security K, we talked about that. You can do that as an AF. We would be literally embracing vulnerability and trying to reject this notion of projecting our presence on the world out of a need for security. Sounds like we solve it. Abolition. So if you're a fan of abolition democracy and you want to abolish the prison industrial complex and abolish all slavery structures, military presence, that's just global policing. Policing, prison industrial complex, all goes together. Abolish that. Resolution works as a part of abolition. It's a non-reformist reform. Militarism. I think that this is the best place to go. Not the best place. It's a really good place, okay? It's a place that I have fun with. Militarism. So there's a lot of really good theorists that talk about this notion that our society has been over-militarized and that we've been primed in every aspect of our lives to believe that the military is natural, that the military is good, and then believe that the military is necessary. And militarism says that we should reject that in a lot of instances. This creeping militarism allows us to have these never-ending wars and allows us to live constantly on the brink of destruction because we believe that we always have to, when in reality we can just reject militarism, and the AF can always be a good place to do that. And there's a lot of theorists who talk about why speaking in educational spaces as high school students or college students are particularly important to rejecting militarism. And then one of my other favorite soft left discussion areas is marine mammals. The military really hurts marine mammals. The boats, they run into whales. Their sonar explodes whales. They use battle dolphins. They have mines. It's not good for turtles. Turtles aren't mammals, but there's a lot of discussions as to why that's really bad. And again, really good critical literature about that. Lots of stuff. Okay. Plus, I just kind of think it's fun to talk about battle dolphins. It's kind of, I don't know. I'm a silly man. All right, other affirmative approaches for critical. Now, again, if you want to go more critical and not do the soft left thing, you can just take any argument from the neg and read it on the AF and have fun and just add some sort of cards as to how you relate to the resolution. It's pretty clear. Other approaches, though, that are going to be a little bit more unique. You can do futurity AFs. Want to end military presence? Well, let's imagine a world where they're not there, and some other group or people or population have controlled the future in fantastic and wonderful ways that are far better than everything we live in now. Now, if you don't like the futurity approach, you can go for the extra T grab bag affirmative. Like, for instance, if you just don't want to do the whole resolution for abolition, you can say do that in the prison industrial complex, in policing, in border surveillance, in border regimes, provide right to housing. Just do it all. Do it all. Defend it all. It's totally defensible. And you can do that too. Then there's also the sabotage AFs. Do not have the United States federal government end its military presence in the region. We should sabotage them ourselves. That would lead to some good praxis for things. Maybe it's eco-sabotage. Maybe it's something else. I don't know. And along the same line, there's all sorts of radical actions that you can do. There's all sorts of liberatory groups. I told you about Algeria and Fanon. That's not just a critical argument. You can embrace those types of Fanonian forms of resistance, or the Algerian Revolution as an analytic where we don't need the United States to end its military presence. We got this. Now, that was a lot. So thank you for sticking with me. Thank you for sticking with us. If you have any more questions about this resolution, please make sure that you stay tuned to my LD Coach on YouTube, because there's going to be a lot more videos about everything. So good luck for all of you who have topics in the upcoming months. There'll be more stuff headed your way.